Hey everybody, Peter Maravellis here. I hope this finds you all safe and well. On behalf of City Lights booksellers and publishers, I'd like to welcome you to City Lights Live, the virtual reading series that continues in the footsteps of our in-store calendar during the time of the pandemic. We continue to celebrate the works of authors we know and love with readings, discussions, and forums moving into the spring season. Today's event is brought to you in conjunction with Litquake and Scribner Books. We are delighted to have back in the house, even if it's only a virtual house. It is a pleasure nonetheless to welcome Rachel Kushner back to City Lights. We're happy to be celebrating the launch of her fantastic new collection of essays. It's titled The Hard Crowd Essays from 2000 to 2020. It is, of course, published by Scribner Books. She will be joined in conversation by Dana Spiotta, somebody else who is no stranger to City Lights. But before we begin, I'd like to bring out our partner in crime for tonight's event, Jack Bulwer of Litquake. Hey, Jack. It's
Peter.
Nice to have Litquake on board again.
Oh gosh, thank you for allowing us to co-present this. As soon as Rachel's book excerpt was published in the New Yorker, immediately I got 7 emails about it. That never happens. And of course I read it right away and I thought, oh, I can't wait for the rest of this book. And it's great. I'm really glad to be part of this tonight.
Yeah, I mean, as we're both kind of longtime denizens of the Bay Area. I mean, I grew up here, and you've lived here long enough to know better.
1983.
Yeah. So, I mean, speaking for myself, I can say these essays really evoked kind of a flood of memory when we've both known many of the haunts and of course many of the characters that are mentioned in some of those pieces. But, you know, even in the essays that don't tie into San Francisco directly, I mean, there's a really strong kind of a West Coast aura about a lot of them. And they kind of capture that animating spirit of kind of life in the 90s. But, you know, not to say that, you know, the essays are all about the West Coast. I mean, there's some really great stuff about art and politics and kind of a range or, you know, wider range of material. But I think being a San Franciscan, it was kind of moved by that stuff. So, so good to have you with us, Jack.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's a flood of memories. There's so many names, you know, there names of bars, restaurants, stores. Oh my gosh. It's almost as if it was written by somebody who never grew up here in a way, because there are things that when you live here for so long, you notice things, but then you forget them. You don't necessarily write them down and write about them later. And it was great that, you know, there's some distance there and you get to sort of revisit really an exceptional period of San Francisco history, I think, growing up, you know, and living through the 90s and the early 2000s here. It was kind of spectacular and raw and strange and kind of out there. And I wish it was around again. Maybe it will be.
Well, listen, Jack, it's a real pleasure to have Litquake on board for this. For those of you who might not be as familiar with Rachel's work, some background may come in handy at this point. She is the best-selling author of 3 novels, the Booker Award and a National Book Critics Circle Award shortlisted The Mars Room. Also, of course, the legendary Flamethrowers, Telex from Cuba, which is a finalist for the National Book Award. And she also has a new novel coming out from Karma Press. It's titled The Mayor of Leipzig. She grew up in San Francisco and makes her home in Los Angeles. So as mentioned, Dana Spiotta will be doing the honors tonight. Dana is the author of 4 novels, including The Innocents and Others, which won the St. Francis College Literary Prize and was shortlisted for the Los Angeles Times Book Prize. Also Stone Arabia, Eat the Document, which was a National Book Award finalist in fiction. Also Lightning Field. Dana's received numerous honors for her work. She won a Rome Prize from the American Academy in Rome and also a John Updike Prize in Literature from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. She lives in Syracuse and teaches in the Syracuse University MFA program. She also has a new novel coming out this summer, and City Lights is happy to be hosting an event for her as well. The new novel is called Wayward and is published by Alfred Knopf, so keep an eye peeled for that. I'd like to let everyone know we will be posting links in the chat function with which you may purchase books tonight. We'll also be hosting Q&A at the end of the reading and discussion, so post your questions and comments in that same chat function. So it is a delight and a great pleasure to have both of you here with us. Rachel Kushner, Dana Spiotta, welcome to City Lights Live.
Thanks, Peter.
Thanks, Peter. And thanks to City Lights. And it's really an honor to be a part of this event and part of the legendary City Lights. So I have a very brief introduction of Rachel that I'm going to read, and then I'm going to ask her questions, and then she's going to read, then I'm going to ask her questions, and then you guys will have your questions in the chat, okay? And there also will be information about how to buy her books, autographed copies of her books in the chat as well, I believe. Rachel and I have been friends for a long time, but aside from my personal affection for her, she is one of my favorite writers. And this passionate, moving book hit me on so many levels, but let me briefly mention three. One level is the uncanny overlaps in our sensibilities, but on a deeper level, and in all her books, I love what she uncovers. I am always discovering new interests, like the film and person Anna, or the painter Alex Brown, or the activist Ruth Wilson Gilmore, or the idea of convulsing an image. When I read Rachel's essays, I learn new things or I revisit things in a new way, and I get inspired. In other words, her writing makes me feel more alive to the world. But finally, all of the above really happens at the most important level, the sentence level. Rachel writes sentences that are distinctly her own. They work a kind of miraculous geometry wherein things connect, recur, even leap to some alternate, unexpected, sublime plane. There is at least one on every page of this collection. In her own words, quote, "But every writer aspires to have some margin of original power, a patterning and order that comes to them as a gift bestowed and is sent to no one else." Rachel Kushner is such a writer of many gifts, both bestowed and hard-earned. So please welcome Rachel as she reads from her new collection.
Gosh, thanks, Dana. That's so nice. Coming from you, it means the world to me. I'm very flattered. Dana is also one of my favorite writers. And it's not because we're friends. I was a huge admirer of her work before I ever met her. And she continues to be an author whose books I can't wait to read. I was just going to read a couple short passages from this book. Here's the book. A few years ago, I was in Eufaula, Alabama for a family reunion, not my own, but my in-laws. I stopped at a thrift store. Walking the aisles, I came upon a dollhouse with a yellow plastic roof. I know that roof, I told myself. I know that house. The blue tulip silhouettes on the window shutters. I knew everything. I peered in the little windows at the little kitchen and the tiny bathroom and the photograph of wood grain papering the den. Did anyone ever have a den, or just fictional people on television shows and the implied fictional people whom dollhouses bespeak? The dollhouse was stained and dirty. It had a layer that marked it as not mine, but its rooms were primal scenes to which I held claims, to which I was returning inside this thrift store in Eufaula, Alabama. I had owned this model of dollhouse, a menagerie as I understood, peering in the windows of everything that grips me and won't let go. Since the little house already owned me, there was no need to buy it. It is amazing what from the past you can drag into your net only to find that it has never left your net. At a restaurant in Venice, Italy, the old waitress insisted we not order, and instead she commanded that we be served the catch of the day. The catch of the day were these burglar-mugged fishies, bottom feeders, that looked like cartoon drawings of bank robbers, proletarian faces deep fried. As essentially a bourgeois, my decency was offended. Or maybe I was offended that these little scofflaws got caught in a dragnet, and I felt for them. Anyhow, the waitress forgot to bring silverware. It's said that capitalism relies on a system of selling something you don't own to someone who doesn't want it, which is identical to how a Lacanian defines love. The lover makes a gift of his banality as if it were a wonder. He pretends to offer something more than his banality, a piece of the world that reflects his love and that he does not in reality possess. In both cases, love and futures, you force something you don't own onto someone who does not want it. And then there's just a short paragraph from an essay on the writer Clarice Lispector. When she was living in Chevy Chase, Maryland in the 1950s, playing or simply being a housewife, Clarice Lispector's own contribution to the American Christmas tradition of holiday decorations was to cover a pine tree on her front lawn with dangling, irregular forms in black, gray, and brown. For me, she said, that's what Christmas is. It's important not to let cultishness stand in for the experience of Lispector's sentences directly, and yet the surreal mythologies of her life, like her somber Christmas decorations, are a little too tempting to resist. Her dog smoked cigarettes and drank alcohol. She once held a dinner party and forgot to serve food. She said organ music was demonic, but that she wanted her life to be accompanied by it. She wrote an advice column for a Rio paper with tips such as, act as if your problems don't exist, and no matter how French your perfume is, it's often the grilled meat that matters. Friends spoke of her scandalous cosmetics application, which grew more extreme after she fell asleep smoking and was badly burned. Her makeup evolved even further when, in the years directly before she died, she asked her makeup artist to apply permanent cosmetics monthly while she slept. The way she writes of vanity coheres with this odd detail of her permanent makeup. What others get from me is then reflected back onto me and forms the atmosphere called I. Femininity, after all, is both natural and fake. It's a mask. And it is the unifying impression a woman makes, the thing that keeps her gathered, recognizable to herself and others. I wouldn't have been able to stand not finding myself in the phone book, the elusive GH says. And so why not permanent makeup for the woman who feels she is slipping in more sense than one?
Great. Thank you, Rachel.
Sure.
I have a couple of questions about that last bit that you read, and that's your epigraph, that line about the eye, right?
Yeah.
I'm curious, it seems to come up a lot in the book, throughout the book, which is probably why you chose it as the epigraph. But I want to talk about that David Rattray, is that how you say his name, Rattray?
Yeah.
Essay, which I loved. You have this sentence that sort of seems to connect to that. For Rattray, invisibility meant to take leave of the self in order to merge or submerge into life to fully understand it. This seems like a great definition of what a writer does. Is that what you do when you write about people like Cheryl or the kids you grew up with? If we are someone whose life is not a poem, do you write stories about others whose lives are?
It's such a great question. And it makes me think, oh gosh, maybe I should have read the David Rattray part instead. It's always, you never know how to, the kind of the fool's errand of trying to give people a taste of your book by finding the thing that does all the things the book does is a never ending hunt. But so this essay about this writer, David Rattray, who actually, had translated a book of Artaud that was published by City Lights. I don't know what year, but early 1960s. Later, there was a book, was it published while he was alive or after he died, called How I Became One of the Invisible. And that was published by Semiotext. So the essay in the book is a preface to a new edition of that. And so Rattray was a translator of Artaud. He spoke about 8 languages. He went to Dartmouth with my father, who knew him in college, although Rattray was older. He was leaving Dartmouth when my father was, I believe, a freshman. And subsequently, and not too long after, he went to St. Elizabeth's Hospital in DC to visit Ezra Pound and make that pilgrimage that people were making, and then wrote up this essay about Pound that's wonderfully funny. But so in terms of, him reading people, I can't remember the line, as though they were books. Is that it? Yeah.
Yeah.
So my sense of Rattray, in thinking about him and asking people about him, notably my parents, when I was writing that, is that he was a person for whom the world was deeply encoded, like in tiny script, like a book is full of information, and maybe could only understand people through books. I have a line in that essay that, to understand people, he was always quoting poetry. And I've known other people like that who are drawing from literature in order to try to make legible for themselves who other people are and what their spirit is and why they do what they do. And when he does that with Pound, he quotes lines of Pound to understand Pound. Now, I think that, like, in that essay, the distinction between Rattray and the other people I write about, who, one of whom I was close to myself, Johnny Sherrill, was my parents' best friend. We grew up with him. He was with us before I was born, when they caravanned in their school bus from St. Louis to Eugene, Oregon, and then worked in the shipyards in San Francisco, lived in Rodeo. We knew him for a long time. David Rattray was really interested in people who were kind of into the honeypot of life and had a natural relationship to reality that was not mediated by books.
Rachel, can I interrupt you though?
Please.
You also, though, when you're in the title essay, you talk about the people who are that are sort of more in the moment than you were, and that it was sort of your obligation, almost a moral obligation, for you to write about them. Am I correct in that? I mean, that's sort of, how are you different from Rattray, or do you see any connection between how he views the world and how you do?
That's such a good question. Well, I didn't really know Rattray myself. I just heard about him from my parents, and it kind of sounded like they made this opposition between people who had a talent for life and people who had a taste for and appreciation of people who had a talent for life. And maybe there's a continuum there that has extremes at either end. And maybe I'm not to that extreme. And some of what is in this book is material that's built up from long stretches of my life where perhaps I did have a talent for life, which is to say, maybe I wasn't focusing on my craft or really directly becoming a writer. I was taking the divigating path of being with people who were very rooted in the present tense, and I valued that so much that I was with them there. But as I say in the title essay, a writer is someone who's left early no matter what time they get home. So you're right that I am alluding to some distance that's installed maybe through the act of writing more than, for instance, somebody like Rattray, who can't really understand what people are doing without, like, reading Tennyson or, reading Faulkner,
Right.
or citing some, Sanskrit poem or something. And I'm less bookish than that by a lot.
Yeah, it seems like you have the perfect approach, which would be to, how did you put it? The people that are not people in the present tense, right? For your youth, right? Your wild youth, but not really. You're kind of like around a lot of wild people, and you were pretty wild. I mean, you did have a big motorcycle accident and so on, but then you kind of transitioned into this person and that's what's so interesting about that essay, is your relationship to those memories and your own sort of self-doubt about it, right? About whether you remember things accurately, whether you can meet the moment of what those people deserve. It's very beautiful. It's very beautiful. You're yearning in that. And this, anyway, we'll get to that in a second, but I wanted to ask you about just the process. I know that everyone's going to ask you these questions about writing fiction versus nonfiction. And I read somewhere that you said with your novels, you begin with imagery more than an idea or a character. So with the nonfiction, and these range from pieces about specific books to journalism, like the prison story and the Palestine, and then there's the ones that are personal essays, right? Like The Girl on a Motorcycle, so I guess they might all have different origins, but where do you begin with that, and how is that different as a process from what you write in fiction? Yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, it is kind of a different process for me. Although I sometimes feel guilty to try to make declarations about which is harder, or how one does one thing, because for some people, the essay is what literature is. For me, fiction is more difficult, and so in a certain way, it's what I've signed on to do with my life, because the process can be so mysterious and fickle and unreliable. And I'm waiting to kind of catch a wave or get the drift, and then try to figure out how to sustain it, and then how to change it in order to sustain it. And you're managing so many different things at once is a very curious hermeneutic, because you need to know where you're going, but then you also need to let happenstance inform you. I think some of the ways that we are challenged and we learn in our lives and also as writers is by having encounters that we did not anticipate or predict, and that happens in fiction. And then you're kind of in a taking mode, and you know exactly what's for you, and you go with it and you run. Essays are a little different for me. I mean, obviously the time is shorter, but usually they seem to kind of, the motor of the essay is a sprung sentence. Like, I come up with one sentence that is doing something in the syntax, and it's making something sort of declarative, and it's kind of a gambit, and it needs to be followed by another. And sometimes I'll have a whole paragraph like that, and those paragraphs will just be kind of floating in the void of the potentiality of the essay that I haven't written yet. And I don't sweat, like, how am I going to link this to that yet? Because I just know by instinct that they're both going in. And if I put them in the essay, then they, are interrelated by virtue merely of their proximity to each other. But then I start to build links. And I guess, it depends on what it is. Like, some of the journalism is a very different process. Like, you mentioned the piece that I wrote originally for the New York Times Magazine about prison abolition, and the carceral geographer Ruth Wilson Gilmore. That I'd written a version of. They said it can be any length and make it long. So, it was like 20,000 words. And it was my version of that essay. And it probably was a pretty good essay, but I think the weakness in it was that I was not speaking to their audience. And you have written for the New York Times Magazine, they want to be able to countenance everything you say, sentence by sentence. It's not like writing an op-ed where you just say your thing and then people can fight it out in the comments. They want to be fully on board. And I wouldn't want to have to do that all the time. It's extremely difficult, because you have to keep remembering how to bring in somebody who may have wildly different ideas about how society should be organized, and not seem polemical, not seem pushy. It's a kind of seduction that I think really benefits from collaboration with an editor. It's arduous. It takes time. That essay took 2 years to write, but because the subject matter was important to me, ultimately, I decided it was worth it.
Yeah, it's such a great essay, and I learned so much from it. I mean, the abolition of prisons, I knew something about that, but I love the distinction in the essay between what people think is the problem, the privatization of prisons, but really the violence of the state and the sort of excessiveness of the state, essentially. And I really like how in all of your essays, there is this critique of capitalism, but there's also a critique of the violence of the state as well. And I think, is that partially why you're so obsessed with the Italian left and autonomia and all of that, because there is that kind of critique built into that. Is that partially what you found beautiful about that?
I don't know. I mean, so autonomia, I wasn't really it wasn't sort of like it fit in with the politics that predated it. Not, which isn't to say that I don't have my own political interests. I guess I always have. But I didn't know anything about Italy until about 2003. And at that point, through my husband, we were in Italy, and he knows a lot about autonomia. He's more in the kind of philosophical, political theory side of things. And he introduced me to some people who know a great deal about that, one of whom had actually been involved in it and had been the girlfriend of somebody that was in the, I guess what you'd call the third wave of the Red Brigades. And the feelings that I had being around people who had kind of sacrificed everything to a political movement in one sense or another made me feel intrigued about autonomia, and I wanted to understand it. And there are a lot of subtleties and unspoken things about that movement in terms of who was open and in the streets and part of the student movement and the feminist movement that are, hallmarks of Italy in the 70s, and who was part of actually a kind of armed militant movement. And sometimes those are the same people, but in two different contexts. And I started asking people questions, and people were happy to talk to me and tell me stories. And I felt like this is a gift that I'm getting access to the anecdotal richness, unwritten, of a real historical movement that for several reasons had not really been written about and treated as fiction, as art in Italy, because people just weren't ready to. Now a little bit more, but when you would ask people, it was still very raw. People that were less eager to talk about the good old days of tumult and revolt. So I think that's more how I got into that. But certainly it interests me that it's kind of like, it's very different than May 1968. It's it's a movement that did have some lasting effect, although the assassination of the former prime minister Aldo Moro seems to have brought on a very hard turn to the right. So for instance, like by the time I lived in Italy for a year, less than a year actually, when I was 18, it was the 80s and Berlusconi was about to come to power. Cicciolina was in the parliament, so that was interesting, but it was a very materialistic reactionary culture in Italy. And I didn't know at the time about the 70s. And learning about it helped me to fill in some parts of my own history with the place so that I could see that what I felt and was so cold and alienating when I was there was a response to something that had come before it.
I really loved also the essay about Nani Balestrini. And you say this really interesting thing in that essay, speaking of the Italian left, you say, I have often wondered if a novelist needed to have contempt for humanity a la Celine to have a great style. So could you talk a little bit about style, cynicism, and irony, and the idea of being fueled by revolutionary possibility instead?
Yeah, wow. That's a tough question, Dana, but it's a really good one. Yeah. So, I mean, sometimes maybe you do this as well when you're writing, you kind of use yourself as the fall guy or foil. So I was kind of, in a way, making fun of my own early admiration for very nihilistic writers like Celine. I mean, is Genet a nihilistic writer? I'd have to think about that. Some of the French stylists tend to be. And I used to think that kind of to be a comic writer, you have to be a nihilist because you're sort of willing to make fun of everything. And I always felt this split that the kind of literary style I admire most is achieved by people who are not like me, because I'm not a nihilist. I believe in life. I believe that every person possesses a soul. I believe in joy, corny as it may sound, like the small puffs of it that you poke over the course of the day and the larger streams of it in life. And so I was thinking, well, why do I admire these writers who are so bleak? And then Nani comes along for me. Nani Balestrini is a very unique writer. He's two novels about Italy in the 70s, and they're both magnificent. The Unseen, Gli Invisibili, and We Want Everything, which is about the wildcat strikes at Fiat in the hot autumn of 1969, 1970. And he has a ferocious sense of humor and an incredible style, but he's also somebody who was kind of full of hope and energy, who wanted to be a part of his time. I mean, I guess Curzio Malaparte would be the opposite of that. Somebody with so much style, he's got too much style. It's like, it can be too much, and doesn't believe in anything. So at one point he's a Catholic, at one point he's a communist, at one point he's a fascist, at one point he's an anti-fascist, whereas Nani had very clear ethics and politics. And I was lucky enough to know him and become friends with him and to see up close that kind of positive energy of somebody who's always looking around him to what's interesting, what's beautiful, who's doing interesting stuff. And those people, like Nani, if I may generalize, tend to not be nostalgic, and they tend to be really interested in what's on the horizon now, what younger people are doing. So he, I guess, is an example to me of a person who embodies that kind of positivity.
Well, I think in this collection, in your books and your novels as well, and particularly in the Mars Room, and in this collection, there's so much passion and soulful. There is a lot of soul here, and it's very moving. And I think I want to get to the sort of crown jewel of this book, which is the title essay, which I know you're going to read from, and then we'll go to the questions. Does that sound good? I have so many questions for you, but I'm going to let the audience ask some too.
Sure. Yes. Okay. Yeah. So, all right. Yeah, I'll just read a little bit from the title essay. All right. Oh, so this is about, it starts with a reference to a bar that no longer exists on Geary between Jones and Taylor called the Blue Lamp, where I worked as a bartender when I was young. And my first shifts, maybe I could just add, where I worked the morning shift there. The early morning shift, the 6 a.m. shift. The owner of the Blue Lamp was named Bobby. I remember his golf cap and his white boat shoes and the broken purple capillaries on his face, the gallery of sad young women who tolerated him in exchange for money and a place to crash. Bobby's brother would drive his Harley right into the bar. Bobby lived out in the Excelsior, but the two brothers built an apartment upstairs from the Blue Lamp for especially wild nights. I never once went up there. It wasn't a place I wanted to see. Sometimes the swamper, Jer we all called him, slept up there when he knew Bobby wasn't coming around. But mostly, Jer slept in the bar's basement, on an old couch next to the syrup tanks. Jer's life philosophy was, we'll work for beer. He restocked the coolers, fetched buckets of ice, mopped up after hours, drank 40 bottles of Budweiser a day, and only resorted to harder stuff on his periodic Greyhound trips to Sparks to play slots. That Jer preferred Sparks to Reno was one of the only things about himself that he vocalized. In addition to slots, Jer played video poker. We had a machine in the bar called Hot Point that paid out to winners illegally in cash. Whole parts of Jer, I suspected, were missing, in some kind of permanent dormancy. I wondered who he had been before he lived this repetitive existence of buckets of ice and Budweiser day after day after day. He owned nothing. He slept in his clothes, slept even in his mesh baseball hat. I know. I saw. He lived at the bar and never went out of character. He was a drinker and a swamper. He said little, but it was him and me, day after day and night after night. A bartender and her bar pack are a kind of platonic pair, and Jer had my back, literally. After 2 a.m. closings, he would come outside and watch me start my motorcycle, an orange Moto Guzzi I parked on its center stand on the sidewalk. He insisted I call the bar when I got home. I always did. These tenderloin bars were human puzzles. There was one up the street that had a double bed in the back where a man lay all day like it was his hospice. You'd be playing pool and drinking with your friends, and there was this man in bed behind a rubber curtain. Even the names of these establishments, all part of an invisible Tenderloin circuit, evoke for me this half-lit world. Cinnabar, the Driftwood, Jonelle's. I remember a man, youngish and well-dressed, who would come into the Blue Lamp and act crazy on my shifts. Once he came in threatening to kill himself. I said, "Go ahead, but not in here." Did I really say that? I doubt it. I can't remember what I said. I never wrote about most of the people from the Blue Lamp. If I transformed them into fiction, I might lose my grasp on the real place, the evidence of which has otherwise evaporated. The bar is gone. All those people have died. That might be why. Or perhaps a person can write about things only when she is no longer the person who experienced them, and that transition is not yet complete. The person who writes about her experience is not the same person who had the experience. The ability to write about it is proof of change, of great distance. Not everyone is willing to admit this, but it's true. In this sense, a conversion narrative is built into every autobiography. The writer purports to be the one who remembers who saw, who did, who felt, but the writer is no longer that person. In writing things down, she is reborn, and yet still defined by the action she took, even if she now distances herself. In all a writer's supposed self-exposure, her claim to authentic experience, the thing the writer omits reporting on is her galling idea that her life might become a subject put to paper, might fill the pages of a book.
That's just fantastic. This is gorgeous. Okay, so do you want to look at some of these questions that you have?
Well, what do you do when you have 88 questions? There's no fair way to vet them.
Should we start at do you want to start at the top, or what do you want to do?
Well, it looks like actually a lot of it is like people talking to each other. So maybe we should have Peter look through and find some questions.
I do have a question for you about what you just read while we're waiting for that, okay? Which is,
all right.
So my question is, of those who leave and live to tell, meaning you, and those who are left behind and some of whom die, you say the real world places would never be in books if you didn't write them. And you talk about this idea of writing as testimony, but also that some things are not appropriate to write about in fiction. And does it seem as though nonfiction is the more appropriate place for some of these things, like talking about your friend Thomas, who died?
Well, I mean, that is such an extreme example of Thomas Wenger, who was brutally, horrifically murdered and was a regular of mine at the Blue Lamp. And, somebody who, when you're a bartender and you are the one who is assigned to kind of make it through the sagging, dead hours of the afternoon, whoever is sort of willing to keep your company, if you like that person, if you don't mind their company, you start to feel a sort of intimacy with them. And a lot of the people who came into the Blue Lamp over those years, were involved in their own dramas that kind of trailed into the bar with them. And so I was kind of exposed to people's lives, and also had friends from childhood who came into that bar and were involved in dramas in the Tenderloin. So the extreme nature of his murder was something that just did not seem to lend itself to fiction. I didn't understand it. And as I say in the essay, kind of in a way, like it's blackly comic to say this, but if I put that detail in a novel, people would think I was making it up because it's too extreme. There are things from childhood that I have put in novels, and The Mars Room, in a certain way, was me exploring certain, maybe more melancholy aspects of what it was like to be an adolescent in San Francisco, and what happened to some of the people that I knew, and the sort of sadness of seeing this distance or trying to understand it. So some of that was there, and I kind of thought that I'd gotten it out of my system. But lo and behold, I ended up writing this long title essay from the hard crowd, much of which is about San Francisco. And maybe I could say one of the weirder things of writing that essay was, although it's lucky that it was excerpted almost the entire thing in the New Yorker, when you publish something in the New Yorker, it's no longer kind of the bubble of your dream about the past, for better or worse. They actually contact every single person you mention in the essay. So, my friend Jeannie Hicks, I don't name her, but I say I have a friend who got a job at KFC on Eddy Street in the Tenderloin. This seemed impossibly grown up to me, and I shortly thereafter copied her and got a job at Baskin Robbins. They called Jeannie Hicks, who lives in Bakersfield now, did you work at KFC when you were 15? They called my friend Armin Croft. Did you see an agnostic front show at the 6th Street Rendezvous in blah, blah year? Was there beer on the floor? Was there a fist fight? And they really went after every single detail. So that becomes interesting because in a certain way, then you start to make interventions in reality. Like I mentioned this poster that I remember in the Greyhound station on 6th Street when you would walk in, and it was actually kind of like the design of your paperback from Innocents and Others, where it has a dark silhouette, like a line of a figure, and then it said, runaways call for help. Now, I remember this from taking the bus, which my mother told me would help to build my character, to take Greyhound. But after I wrote that essay, somebody wrote me and said that they remembered that poster too. And I became afraid that I had inserted that memory into their mind, which isn't to say that I did, I don't know, but you realize that with nonfiction, you start to mess with the record. Even if you're trying to be specific and precise and true to your own memories, they are subjective. But then they can kind of present themselves as objective, if that makes sense.
It does. Absolutely. Did you get some questions now?
Yeah, so we have a question from Jenny. You wrote about how a person, specifically a writer, could be a tainted magnet. Could you comment on how that might operate for you? Does it change from book to book?
I don't remember the context in which I said that, although it sounds very familiar. So I'm not sure what I meant. A tainted magnet. I don't know. I mean, it sounds to me like maybe a target. Did Jenny elaborate or provide context that I should know from memory alone, but am failing to know?
Let's see if there are any additional comments. Hold on. No, I don't see any other comments there by her, but I have other questions. You wrote about, okay, let's see, hold on. Let me skip down. When you're writing of events and feelings from decades ago, how do you return to the experience? What takes you back?
That's a really great question. With some of these essays, like the first essay in the book called Girl on a Motorcycle, which is about the Cabo 1000, a no longer existent illegal motorcycle road race where you span the length of the mile in the course of a day. That was the first thing that I ever published. And I wrote it 20 years ago. And looking back over it to put it in this book and to improve upon it, I opened it up. I wrote a new beginning and a new ending. There are so many details and scenes in that essay that I never, ever would have remembered had I not written them down when I was much closer to the kind of, meat of that experience. But there are other essays like the title essay, which I just wrote, quite recently. And I put the book together and I knew it was going to be called The Hard Crowd. And then I just basically sat down and wrote this essay. And I think, as maybe you're telling a story or going through your life, sometimes things really do sort of trigger the release of a memory. And Proust has this conception of two different kinds of memory that he calls voluntary memory and involuntary memory. And voluntary memory is a kind of fixed story that you tell, oh, he's telling that story again, meaning like it's a kind of sclerotic, hardened account that for Proust doesn't really have any real artistic or intrinsic wealth to it. Whereas involuntary memory is maybe when you would, smell a perfume that you haven't smelled in 30 years and it reminds you of this or that. And I think that writing itself can activate involuntary memory because you start to see into spaces you haven't seen in a really long time. Like when I was writing this essay, I somehow ended up talking about Terence McKenna and remembered that I had seen Terence McKenna give this lecture at the Palace of Fine Arts. And then I saw the Palace of Fine Arts and him on the stage and where I was sitting and who was in the audience. And so then I mentioned in the essay that this noise musician, not human, who I don't know, but I knew who he was sitting right in front of me. And that was a funny thing because the New Yorker called him, were you at a Terence McKenna lecture in 1991? Yeah, I was. I mean, people probably think like the FBI is after them or something. But so for me, I can start to see things and details in pretty haunting particularity once I'm starting to build the framework that will allow those kind of involuntary memories to come up, to present themselves.
Malcolm has a question. There's a saying that successful people put themselves in the path of opportunity. Do you think the same holds for characters or story in fiction?
Like that the characters themselves put themselves in the path of opportunity. I don't know because I don't really know what opportunity is. Like, I'm a little bit afraid of the word success. I once answered a Q&A about, how do you define success in fiction? And I said, kind of obnoxiously, success is for losers. So there's something about, I don't know what success means. And in fiction, I think maybe this is also a cliche, but people more often than encountering or putting themselves in the path of opportunity put themselves in the path of ruin. And I think that ruin is a more dynamic place for a writer. And, one could explore that or step back from it and think about it. But maybe it's related to how memory works. And most people seem to remember traumatic events more than they remember happy and good events, which isn't to say that fiction can't be happy, but that always seems like something you're pulling off when you find a comic moment, something comic. It's a magic trick that happens. So I don't know, maybe that's putting yourself in the path of opportunity, the opportunity to try to be funny or to say something, but it's hard to differentiate between what the writer is doing and what the characters in the book are doing.
We have a question from Peter Kwong. Do you feel that maybe kids who grew up in a certain era share communal memories, like growing up in San Francisco in the 70s is full of shared moments and scenes?
Yes, I do feel that, but I would maybe even particularize it to not just an era, but kids who grew up in a certain world within San Francisco. And I'm going to just be blunt. It's the kids who went to public school in San Francisco in the 70s and 80s. We all traversed a world together. And the particularity of that world, I'm not saying that it's, special or different. Everybody has a world that they traversed and that stays inside of them as memory. And ours is ours. And those who experienced it do feel bonded, I think, for life in a way. And it's something I've thought about a lot since that essay was published in the New Yorker, because of the number of people who reached out to me and wanted to talk about their own memories of this same world that we shared.
Andrew has a question. Can you talk a bit about the influence of Don DeLillo on your work?
I would say, Dana and I are both influenced by Don DeLillo. In fact, when she mentioned in her really complimentary introduction something that I'd said, a quote about things that are coming only to you and no one else, it reminded me of something I think that she told me that Dawn said to her. I shouldn't speak for her, but I'm going to, which is that there are things that only you know about the world, which is such a beautiful way to describe why we write fiction and what we do. Yeah, DeLillo's work is unique. It's phenomenal. This year is the 50th anniversary of his first novel, Americana, which is one of the stranger books and ends with a drunken orgy on a test track. And I actually just asked him recently what that was about, and he said, I have no idea. But then told me a story about going to a Sears and Roebuck truck tire test track in Pecos, Texas, when he was an ad man. And that was as if to account for how it was he was able to create a scene to close a novel that evokes radical pathologies in American life. And, you know, I think that he's mysterious. His writing, it changes a lot. The Silence, his new book, is really interesting. So yeah, he's a writer that I'm very interested in and admire a lot.
So we're coming up on the hour, but I think we have time for maybe a couple more questions. Hazel asks, in the New York Times review, Dwight Garner mentioned the phrase, at the party, she was kindness in the hard crowd, from the Cream song In the White Room. Is that in fact where your title came from?
It is, and actually, I mentioned that in the title essay. It all becomes clear, at least somewhat clear, where I heard that song, and why I made it the title of this book. It's a good line.
And then Malcolm asks, my question is in regard to something you said about writing fiction. So a good story is, I guess, what I'm talking about, building an interesting world, perhaps. Huh. Might be a better way of phrasing
Skipping
it.
over the dirty parts of the question.
Yeah. Let's see. Maybe there's something else here too. Are there any current writers that have especially helped in getting you through the lockdown days during this COVID year?
Current writers is, well, I'm looking forward to reading Dana's book. It's always hard to remember what you've been reading when you're asked that on the spot. Any current writers? I read all the time, but less living writers. Well, I read
About movies.
Say it again.
About movies.
So many movies, yeah. I mean, we were talking about movies before we went live. I watch movies almost every night. And Dana and I were discussing Paul Newman and Piper Laurie in The Hustler, which is one of the great films, and also stars Jackie Gleason as Minnesota Fats and George C. Scott. And I love the way that rolls off the tongue. Say it with me, George C. Scott. He's so incredible in that film, and Paul Newman seems to be embodying one facet of a character that actually steps out of that film and travels into other films, namely Cool Hand Luke and HUD. HUD is, for whatever reason, my favorite movie of all time. And I revisited that during quarantine, and I recommend it as a movie that also not only is wonderful in every way and can teach you a lot about fiction in the way that character is established so quickly. What does he do in the very beginning of the film? He runs over Patricia Neal's flower bed in his Cadillac. She says, "You parked on my flowers." So that movie is about a pandemic, basically, among cows, not people. And they end up having to kill all of these cows that have foot and mouth disease at the end of the film, and it is totally devastating. But you think about contagion. I watched it very early in the pandemic, and now we've all become almost inert. Is that the word? We're very used to the idea of a pandemic. But at first, it was quite strange, like we were living in a sci-fi movie, and then you realize, no, these are cycles and waves of issues that affect humanity, in rhythm, in and out, over, every 100 years or so, and among cattle as well.
So it sounds like Paul is suggesting that he would love to read an essay by Rachel about HUD, The Hustler, and Paul Newman. So would I.
I'll think about that.
I wish we just sort of had a channel that we could just flip on and this conversation could just go on forever. But we are out of time, regretfully. But really, man, thank you so much. This has been just such a delight. Hope you'll all be safe and well, and look forward to seeing you again in the near future. Rachel, Dana, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Dana. And I just want to add one thing about people who want signed books. I drove 600 miles to sign those books.
On a motorcycle.
No, in my car, in my very unsexy Subaru. So thanks, everyone.
Good night, everybody. Thank you.